Hi everybody, welcome to Video 12D. Here I simply want to apply the lessons that we learned in the last one about different kinds of systems and their feedback loops to think about the bigger questions of segregation. And I think it's pretty obvious that when we think about these various systems, we know that economy and culture influence one another. The way we think about other people interacts with how we do business with those people. The way we do business with those people shapes the resources that they have and therefore shapes our opinion of them. We certainly saw this with regard to segregation. African Americans moving into places like Black Bottom, who were very restricted in where they could live, faced much higher rent, so they had less resources available to actually do the maintenance and the other kinds of upkeep that you would expect in a homeownership area, and therefore people thought ill of them and were even less likely to want them to live in their community, and we see this kind of cycle emerging over and over again. Similarly related, that cycle between anticipation about property values and actual segregation, actual discrimination, as people perceived that African Americans would cause a lowering of their property values, they were more likely to defend stringently against African Americans moving in, and when they finally did, the people in that environment took it as the final loss and sold their property very cheaply because they were afraid of losing it all, thus producing exactly the result that they had feared, something that wouldn't have happened if they hadn't had the fear in the first place. There are also significant ways in which structure, both economic and cultural, actually shapes the other institutions. So a culture of segregation, a culture of racism is going to shape the kinds of civic groups that get formed in societies. It's also going to shape the way that people vote. And so if the culture is moving in that racist direction, that pro-segregation direction, you're going to expect to start seeing civic and government organizations following the lead. And if the economy is tending towards segregation, you're going to develop strong economic incentives for market sphere organizations, firms, real estate agents, and so on, to start behaving in a way that preserves that segregation and prevents the risk that seems to be apparent from desegregation. And when we look at the institutions, those have their influence back on the underlying structural questions and on the other institutions. And frankly, you could draw an arrow between every single one of these. I'm just looking at the ones that seem the strongest. So obviously, the way that government works in making loans to some and not making loans to others, in subsidizing certain kinds of behavior and not others, is going to shape what kinds of economic behaviors are profitable, whether segregated suburbs are profitable or not. Government's also going to shape the underlying culture because it's going to tell you sort of what kinds of behaviors are possible. When Hubbard in Dearborn says keep Dearborn clean, meaning keep Dearborn white, it sets up an expectation or a belief that it's perfectly fine for you as a citizen to behave in the same way and encourages your thinking in those regards. And the way that government regulates or doesn't regulate markets, the way it encourages or doesn't encourage certain kinds of behavior with regard to race, is certainly going to shape the way that markets behave and what they price into their overall expectations of how to make money or not. Similarly, markets and market-oriented companies, they're going to shape how the economy runs. They're going to shape what is profitable and what is not profitable. And they're also going to try and shape how government does its business. They're going to lobby for certain kinds of benefits. And so you can see that market organizations that have built their livelihoods around segregated subdivisions or around certain kinds of loans are going to lobby to continue government to function in that way. We see that a lot of the rules by the Homeowners Loan Corporation were made by market actors who were recruited in those roles, especially the real estate appraisers who helped draw those redlining maps. So it was an intersection and a kind of mutually reinforcing cycle between what government wanted to do and how the market actors in government related to government tried to do it, and so on. And finally, we get civic actors involved, and the way that people engage with one another in civic actors is certainly going to shape the way that government ends up acting, because it's going to shape how people vote, but it's also going to shape the underlying culture. So if your civic organizations are behaving in a way that suggests that segregation and racism is perfectly normal, well, then those organizations are going to produce a normalization of that kind of racism, and it's going to cycle back around. So all of these things are influencing one another. And while there are some countervailing influences, for the most part, the overwhelming sets of relationships here, especially between about 1920 and about 1965, 1968, they tended to be largely reinforcing and therefore made the problem of segregation worse and worse and worse. And here we can actually go back and add in Myrdal's model, which was largely an economic model. And so we're finally bringing together the two elements of cumulative causation that we've been talking about, this economic one about deindustrialization and the movement of firms, auto plants, out from the city, and show how that is interacting with and in fact reinforcing the changes in population patterns and the limits of African Americans to live anywhere but in the city of Detroit. And so we've got a system where African Americans are concentrated in the city of Detroit while all of the auto plants are concentrated on the outskirts of the city of Detroit. And that just makes the problem even worse. So here, those two questions, the question of segregation and the question of deindustrialization, those also engage in an autocatalytic cycle where they deepen the problem rather than ameliorating the problem. A couple of scholars named Massey and Denton in the mid-1990s developed a really complex model of how a whole variety of effects influence one another, and quite a bit of their model was based around the interaction between the market sphere and the government sphere. So they began with the presumption of macroeconomic events like a recession or some kind of shock in demand that would shape how businesses behaved and where they went to, and that would shape and be shaped by the tax rates, that all of these would relate to the tax base and the level of public services, and ultimately through those kind of constantly reinforcing cycles could produce a realm of concentrated poverty. So Massey and Denton sort of adapt Myrdal's cumulative causation model to the economy, and then they go on and add a whole series of other interactions that relate to race, because concentrated poverty produces effects both within the community that is being segregated and within the white community, and then that leads to a whole variety of other actions which further deepen the cycle. White antipathy producing white flight, producing bank investment, leading to low housing values, residential segregation resulting from housing discrimination and white flight, and that leading to different deficiencies in the ability of African Americans to rely on social networks and coalitions with white political actors, and that just reinforces the overall economic effect as well. And so you get this kind of stunning cumulative causation model of why deindustrialization is bad enough, but deindustrialization coupled with segregation can lead to intense concentrated poverty of the kind that we see, frankly, in the city of Detroit. Now, if this model looks complex to you and you think, what are we going to do about this? I agree. This is really complicated. But you should also know that if this is the model for deindustrialization and segregation, then this is one model that's been proposed for global warming. So, God, we have a lot of work to do, and we got to tackle this one as well. But we've got to start and we've got to think strategically. So I will leave this for a different class. But for now, I want to think about the Massey and Denton model, and I want to think about what do we do about this. And here's where we turn to our sphere actors, our institutions. So if you want to fix this, you can turn to actors in those particular spheres, the ones that they have some control over. So, some of these are about what market-based organizations do, what banks do, or what businesses do, even in terms of how people react to economic recession and other shocks in demand or supply. Some of these are much more civic kinds of questions about the ways that people talk to one another, the ways that people work together to build coalitions, what people are believing and how they express those beliefs, where they end up going to, and what kinds of organizations they build on the way. And some of these are largely the responsibility explicitly of government, that government gets involved in public services and school achievement, and government sets tax rates. And so, if we want to stop the movement on any of these particular things, try to reverse some of those arrows in the hope that at least neutralizing those arrows might prevent a further deepening and might actually lead to an increase, then we can look to these particular places where markets or civic groups or governments could interact. Markets can get involved in this. The question of whether they want to depends on whether things turn a profit. That's not always the best basis on whether to decide what to do as a society, although I think some would argue that it is. I tend not to agree with that, or argue that profit motive is at best only one of the ways that we should decide what to do as a society. Civic groups give us the ability to decide what we should do as a society. So civic organizations have a big responsibility here, and they can actually take action. But they don't have a lot of ability to enforce their decisions. We've talked about civic groups really depending on people's goodwill rather than on the ability to sort of make anything happen. And so in some ways, the only kind of organization that is open to our input and at the same time has that coercive power is government. Some say that's especially why we need to be especially careful about government, but I think it's also the case that there are places where government can provide a solution, and where government can actually intervene in places where it might not otherwise get involved. So, housing discrimination or residential segregation or job opportunities, those may not be within some people's vision of what government can or should be doing. But there are certainly places where government can get involved, where government can supplement or replace markets, where government can be more persuasive or coercive than civic organizations that are simply asking people for their compliance. And so it's in these areas that I want to talk about what government should be doing. I also want to acknowledge that given what you've heard in the previous couple of videos, we need to be really careful that government is doing the right thing as opposed to the wrong thing in this regard. So government spheres can actually do a lot. Government policy can be really powerful. But if that government policy is designed to segregate, then it's something that we have to get rid of. So we need to think about what government can do, what government policy might allow in particular realms. But we have to be especially careful that government doesn't make things worse rather than making things better. And so that's the kind of frame that I'm going to advance when I'm going to start to talk about what it is that government can actually do. But I do want to spend quite a few videos on the ability of government to become involved productively in solving the segregation problem, especially since government was involved in creating the segregation problem. So to a certain extent, it's government's responsibility to fix its own mess at that critical point during the Great Migration. And in order to do this, we're going to have to use our framework of diagnosing what's wrong, of thinking about what works, and then thinking about what kinds of political solutions might actually be possible, especially in a really divided America. That's the kind of thing that I want to start on in the next video, Video 12e. So join me on the next video.